name is Dominic Campbell. I am a creative producer. A lot of the work that I do is with older adults, and I do most of that as a co-founder of Creative Aging International. We work here, where I am today, in Dublin, Ireland, but we're also growing projects all over the world. And when you start to work with older people and look at creative projects of one sort or another from the lens of older age, what you realize is different people get old at different points in their chronology, in their years, partly because of social determinants of health, partly because of lifestyle, because of the way people live. So all of those issues of equity and inequity are kind of packed up in aging. But the great thing about working with older people is you realize you can have a great deal of fun until you drop. So the way that I got into this was in my early 20s, I would have been a carnival maker. I worked in places like the Caribbean making big carnival costumes. And I love the way that that art form connects people. And I love the way that celebration is an amazing tool for getting people together. People will try things out. It overcomes what my good friend B. Kelleher calls threshold hesitation. So the reluctance to go into an art gallery or into a museum, or people just, it's about play. And so a lot of that informs the way that I work. And what happened for me was at one point I ended up taking on an initiative that became the Bealtaine Festival. So Bealtaine is the Irish word for May. It's a celebration of creativity as we age that takes place across the month of May, and it takes place across Ireland. And so it involves hospitals and healthcare workers and libraries and artists and international artists and Mrs. O'Reilly lives down the street and all sorts of organizations making stuff. And by the time when I started, it was 26 events. When I finished, it was 3,500, 700 partner organizations. What it meant was that different people made creative things for different reasons. So for some people, it was just good crack. For other people, it was about their work. For other people, it was about exploring a particular issue. For other people, it was about social cohesion and connection. So in any given festival, we might have a piece of theatre that might be about what happens when you become invisible, or we might have a street piece of work that happens outside, which is about the same thing. What happens when you get older and you walk down the street and people don't seem to see you? We might have something that was about care staff and care workers. I used to think about it in terms of geography, actually. So there would be things that for people whose whole world was the tray that sits on their hospital bed. And that was as far as they were going to get. And what magical world, what interesting things could you put into that space? Or what could you do for somebody that could make it to the community room down the hall? Or somebody that was hale and hearty and went to the art centre every other week? Or somebody that was interested in international touring? And all of those fitted within Bealtaine.
In terms of this last sort of year or so, have you found older people using technology? What people are using? Have people jumping on Zoom and on online things?
Yeah, so what I've constantly heard is people saying, I'm really amazed that we did this. We talked about this for 10 years and we did it in like a month. And a bunch of examples. There's a choir for people with Alzheimer's and their family and friends here who have been working online. It's as glorious online as it is in real life. It's full of joy. It's hilarious. It's everybody doing it at once. But they've managed to do it because they then sat down and went, what is it that people need to be able to get online? Do I need to talk to the nephew so we can get granny online because they're in the same bubble? There's a show called Secret Country that's made by a company called Relive in Wales that same kind of thing. They had a weekly theatre group. Everybody went online. They spent a couple of months trying to figure it out. And then it just became like everybody's in their front room. So it's normal. And it's become really easy. There's other people I know that started stripping out iPads so they were one button. You turn on and you're straight on, and then distributing those. So they've managed to get stuff to people with mild to moderate Alzheimer's and dementia. So lots of really good stuff. Lots of people saying it's great. But I know there's a whole pile of people who are not there, and increasingly invisible, and those are the people that I think about most, really.
How do you think about games or play, or how does that fit in to just the work you do?
Yeah.
Not online.
So when you first asked me, and I kind of went, gaming, digital gaming, don't do that. But then the more I thought about it, actually, yes, we do. We do lots of playful things. And, this Homo Ludens, man who plays, people who play, it's incredibly key to what I do. And I come from carnival, so the idea of a trickster and the day the world turned upside down, which is what a carnival day is, where the servant wears the costume of the master and turns the world upside down, where men dress as women and women dress as men, all of that stuff. It's all that kind of playful usurping. So I just love the idea of that messing about with the way that reality is presented to you, or systems are presented to you, and the role that creative work plays within that. Because if you can play with that, then actually its imposition on you, or its limitation on you, changes.
What kind of games do you see people playing, especially kind of older generations? Is it limited or is it unlimited? Is it?
I kind of started working with older adults because I was, initially because I was working with kids only. I was making things with kids, and I kind of thought, I'm going to get old and I don't know anything about the other end of life, so let's go work with adults. But also I kind of had this idea in my head that older age, everybody, if they're lucky, gets to be old, and it was some kind of equalizer. And the reality is that's not true. That people get old by, if you define it as illness, at different times. But it's a really interesting lens to work through, because you realize that people are equally diverse in their older age as they are at any other age. So some people are as close to digital native as you would expect. They have an Xbox, they play whatever, they're interested in that, that's their world. Other people probably don't have a mobile phone, and that's partly about interest and partly about, can I afford one, and is it my normal? So there isn't a kind of like definitive. One of the things I really like about working with older people, though, is somebody asked what was the great joy of older age, and it's guile. Actually, it's the ability to kind of be mischievous with people quietly for your own entertainment. So there are those kind of games all the time. I shared a video with you when you asked me about this, which was during lockdown. Lovely people that work in residential care have been being incredibly creative with whatever resources they've got. So people were living in care homes, keeping the COVID lockdown on board and trying to make it an interesting place to be for them as much as somebody else. And there was this brilliant film of people with limited mobility with the Christmas trees, because they've got like 10 Christmas trees in the care home, which they've plonked and made a forest, and the staff are running between them. And the residents have these little softball shotguns, and they're kind of trying to shoot people. And it's just hilarious. It's just brilliant. And you just go, yeah, that kind of playing with what's possible exists all the time.
Are there things that don't work, do you think, with older folk, or are there things that really do, or is it a bit like you were saying that there's such a diversity there that?
I think firstly, I think there's a diversity there. Secondly, I think it's partly about approach and questions. It's partly about the way that people are engaged and involved. So if you can find what makes people curious, most people will try something. Yeah. But how you find that is always, it's the nature of the ask. Is how I would think about it. How do you ask people to do something? When you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about was I used to run St. Patrick's Festival in Dublin. So it used to be, there was no festival, there was just St. Patrick's Day, and every town and city and hamlet had their own procession. And at some point in the 90s, when there was some money in the Irish economy for the first time, they decided, well, let's try and do something with that. And what can we do? And I ended up being the person doing the artistic direction. And what is phenomenal about that as a learning experience really was that you've got to shut a city, and you got to reinvent how people use the city centre for 3 days or 5 days. And so you kind of had to work with everybody. But in the same way that Hogmanay closes Edinburgh, we kind of got to do that. And so you started to think about, well, what happens if you close that street and use it for a procession, or close the air and use it for fireworks, or what is a city other than a place to go and work? And that just opened up so many interesting things that I'm still kind of teasing through them. Everything from, people have such fixed stories in their head about place. So in Dublin, the centre of the city has these definite limits. It's 10 minutes walk from O'Connell Street Bridge. Any further than that, you're not in the city. But if you're a visitor, you've no idea where those are. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Just like, what? Why is that? Well, it is. And so you could literally play around with what you put in different areas to bring people in, or to play around with the expectation. And so that notion about narrative of place or narrative of people, so the stories I tell myself about myself, or that I tell myself or about other people, unpicking those and playing with them. Unpicking those is a function of play. So I kind of always relate that to wicked and sticky problems, really. So I don't really see that there's a limitation. It's just, the only limitation is how do people encounter it? How do you get people curious? I guess the other way is play with expectations. So you can see this in it's really interesting because I old people is my thing since 2006, so getting on for 15, 16 years. But I can see change happening. So there are now an increasing number of movies about famous people who've got Alzheimer's, to the extent that it's become a meme, it's become a thing that happens. There are increasing numbers of programs about people who are in their 70s but dress incredibly well and look crisp and have their own fashion statement. And so they're playing with the expectations of what we think an older person should look like. And it's the costume stuff is really interesting. The clothes, the fashion thing is really interesting because it's so immediate. And very quickly, we get very quickly used to it. So it becomes like, yeah, why wouldn't you dress like that?
Yeah, totally. Everyone's kind of been thrown online in this kind of strange hybrid. Well, it's currently online and thinking about a hybrid world. I just wonder, how are you thinking about that? All of those kinds of thoughts about how you curate a festival, or how you bring people together, or what makes something playful, or what helps people interact.
So increasingly, I'm thinking about how do we use these platforms to connect people who can't physically meet at the moment, so that as the unlockdown happens, there's a preparation for the unlockdown, which includes things like people are not afraid, or I'm not afraid of you because you've got a different accent or different religion, or you live in a different country. Instead, I'm really curious about you and I'm really fascinated by what we've been doing, and so maybe I want to go meet you afterwards when that's possible. So I think what's becoming common in the digital stuff that we're doing is about that, raising curiosity and imagination as a tool for making connection when that's possible, post-COVID, whenever that's going to be. And then finally, the other thing I'm really aware of is that these ways of communicating lack spontaneity. So you rarely get, in a good way, some stranger bumping in and going, "Hello, what's going on with you then?"
Yeah.
And if you work with old people, you realise they don't talk to young people. But society gets really stratified. So how can we chip away at that? What is it that you can do? That can we set up creative projects of some format where people spend a bit of time like this, a bit of time on their own with their own group, a bit more time like this, and they develop an idea and get curious about each other.
What would be useful for you, or for actually what would be useful for lots of the older people you work with, or what would be a
I think for me too, actually for both, but I'll start by talking about me. One of the things I'm looking for at the moment is when I go out and find creative people to work with, I can kind of identify the kind of people I'm meeting, whether they are visual artists or musicians or whatever. And I can spot the ones that are like innovative and a bit messy and will try things out, and the ones that are like, no, I only do this and I'm brilliant at it. And I'm looking for digital collaborators. I'm actively trying to find the kind of equivalent of the creators who work digitally, and trying to find a way that we can mix it all up a bit. So I can work exactly the same way with digital innovators that I can work with theatre innovators or music innovators. And it's one big pond, one big interesting mush. First thing. Second thing is I was just talking, so I do a lot of conversation at the moment with the health service here, and we were talking about the impact on their staff. And I was talking about the role of the arts and creativity and supporting people, and whether that's exciting things to think about or fun things to do, whether it's entertainment or something else. And the guy I was talking to said, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but it has to hit 10% of my staff. And I went, oh yeah, okay, that's 20,000 people. So anything has to hit 20,000 people. And so for me, that's the really interesting thing about digital and gaming, is what can you come up with that has levels of engagement or interest, which is in itself, or can be part of a step towards something that's deep and meaningful, but can connect with people digitally and fast and at scale. And how can we go from people how do we bridge the worlds then? How do we go from people who are creative and use the tools that they've got, bodge them together and make it work using whatever they've got, to big, complicated scale? For me, that's really interesting territory.